Folks, welcome to the afternoon session. My name is Ron Springle. I'm a retired addiction medicine and occupational medicine physician. I've been in Maine about 12 years and have just been amazed about how much energy and enthusiasm there is for recovery advocates here and for what Wendy and I will call the beginning of recovery activism. And we think that's a really special time to be in this place. The three of us up here, we're going to each introduce ourselves, and as far as my introduction is concerned, my main affiliation now would be the Maine Association of Recovery Residences, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that began about a year ago as an affiliate of the National Alliance of Recovery Centers, or NAR. I began a number of years ago, about 3 years ago, and I'll explain how this happened, developing a directory of recovery residences. We call it then Sober House Directory in the state of Maine. And Zoe was kind enough to make some copies of that. They're not in color, but you don't lose much. And I think they were being passed around. If anyone did not get one, raise your hand. They're still coming over here. And it's also available in electronic format. At the end of the meeting, I'll have this mailing list up here. All you need to do is sign on this, and you'll be on the distribution list to receive that update electronically, because it changes a lot. About every 3 months, there's a new edition with a lot of changes. Matter of fact, this came out yesterday. There's already 3 substantial changes that were made today. So as far as introductions, if you have any questions about my background, you can surely ask, but that should be enough for today. I'll turn it over to John.
My name's John Branson. It's really a privilege to be part of this amazing day that folks have put together to help bring us, into the 21st century around working with people who are suffering and treating them with love and compassion. So I just want to thank everyone for putting this together. And I'm an attorney. I have a private law practice on Congress Street. I've been counseling and representing the owners and operators of recovery residences for 15 years. I was sort of, helping the pioneers in the field back in the day. And I'm proud to say, I haven't had to sue the city of Portland a single time. I have assisted in getting the city on board with this wonderful development, more as an ambassador than as a lawyer, I'd say, most of the time. And it certainly works a lot better. We had a great police chief for a long time, Mike Suschuk, who was our biggest advocate, and is a huge harm reduction advocate. We're so fortunate that chief is now got a new position with the city of Portland, where he'll have a lot more to say about policy. So, in any event, I'm just grateful to serve on this panel, and I'll introduce Jesse Harvey now.
So my name is Jesse Harvey. I'm a person in long-term recovery. I'm the founder and program director of Journey House Recovery, which is opening its 4th and pretty soon a 5th recovery house serving individuals. Yep. Thank you. I would be, 2 things that I'm most passionate about today are advocacy and direct services around recovery housing and around safe injection. And I would be remiss and I'd be doing an injustice to my peers if I didn't right now talk a little bit before we get started about 2 other great organizations besides Journey House Recovery, Portland OPS and the Church of Safe Injection, how they're relevant to recovery houses and to treatment and to prevention and all that is that it's all part of a continuum of care, right? That we don't only need recovery houses. There were 418 Mainers last year who never made it to these recovery houses, never made it to treatment, never made it to long-term recovery because they didn't have a safe place to go to use drugs, because they didn't have access to sterile syringes and other safer drug use equipment, and because they didn't have access to the life-saving medication naloxone. In that end, a few weeks ago founded the Church of Safe Injection. I'm begging any of you here who are interested to please get involved. The long-term goal is to apply for religious exemption from the Controlled Substances Act to create safe injection sites in Maine and beyond. And there is precedent for this. So please get in touch with me. I have my business cards with me, and check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/safeinjection. That being said about safe injection, now I'd really like to talk about recovery-oriented housing. It's difficult to get a safe injection site up and running in this country, but you'd be surprised it's actually difficult as well to open a recovery house, and that's what Ron and John and I are going to talk about this afternoon with you all.
Thanks, Jesse. Shame you don't have any passion for this subject. So just a little background on recovery residences, sober houses. By the way, they're not exactly the same thing. We've sort of used those terms interchangeably, sober house, recovery house. What were these places called before they were called those names? Halfway, right, halfway houses. And why did we call them halfway houses? Well, it was really for people who were in prison who were like more than half done their sentence. They would often get out to kind of like a work release before they had those official programs going back a number of years now. But then as people needed places to dry out, to recover, detox needed a place to send people, halfway houses began to spring up all over the country. And then in the 1980s, we had the Oxford House movement, which began. And so Oxford Inc. out of Maryland began to work with state and federal authorities to give seed money, about $4,000 per house, to open around the United States. And that was very successful and was a big shot in the arm for Oxford houses. Of course, they're kind of self-run, democratic. They all have a charter with Oxford Inc., and they have a variety of things they have to adhere to be called an Oxford house. We have 9 right now in the state of Maine, which is pretty cool. No new ones that I know of, but we try and keep the directory updated. I want to just read from the NAR, the National Alliance of Recovery Residences, from their website exactly how they define a recovery residence, because it'd be a lot easier for me than trying to paraphrase it. So, recovery residence is a broad term describing a sober, safe, and healthy living environment that promotes recovery from alcohol and other drug use and associated problems. Many thousands exist in the United States that vary in size, organization, and target population. The exact number is not known. The purpose of recovery residence is to provide a safe and healthy living environment to initiate and sustain recovery. Recovery defined as abstinence from alcohol and other non-prescribed drug use and improvement in one's physical, mental, spiritual, and social well-being. So you notice how careful that definition is of recovery? And the first point I wanted to make was that up until about 5 or 6 years ago, if you were on methadone or Suboxone's been out, about 10 years now, buprenorphine. If you were one of those medicines and wanted to live in a sober house, what did you often find when you went to apply or fill out an application or call to inquire? We found that, oh, we don't take people like you. Well, what do you mean people like me? I meet the definition of recovery from NAR. I have a prescribed medication. So we found that there, within our own recovery community, with I'll call them abstinence-based or abstinence-oriented facilities, there was what some people would call a stigma or a prejudice for people who were on MAT, medication-assisted treatment. Some would argue that it's actually discriminating against people who are on MAT for an abstinence-based house to not accept them. I'll leave that to John to discuss, but I know that's one thing that he wanted to bring up. So when NAR came into being about 5 years ago, they realized there was a problem between the abstinence-based community and the MAT community in terms of just around language. So a sober house, so-called, had pretty much in the vernacular, common vernacular, been thought to be a house where people were not on MAT, not on any mind-altering substance at all, and they considered methadone and buprenorphine to be among those, even if it was prescribed, even if it was taken according to the direction. And they felt that it somehow diminished the clean and sober kind of the squeaky clean environment that they were trying to produce for the benefit of all of their clients. And you can kind of see where they were coming from. We didn't want to have a house with 3 guys on the top floor who were on MAT and then the rest of the house not being on it. There was felt that it would cause some difficulties within the house. That has proven generally not to be that significant a problem, but it's not a problem. When NAR came along, they realized that there was this conflict. And they decided, well, maybe we'll just call these places recovery residences, because how you define sobriety can differ, and that's the problem that they ran into. But recovery residences is, I'd like you to think of as a broader term that includes abstinence-based or non-MAT accepted residences, as well as those that do. When we started this directory, some of which you have copies, was in 2015. We had 55 listed residences, primarily in the southern Maine area. We hadn't branched out to do the whole state yet. Of those, only 6 accepted clients who were on medication-assisted treatment, 6 out of 55. That's 3 years ago. And there were none at that time certified by the Maine Association of Recovery Residences, because we were not in existence until 1 year ago. But this year, actually up to this date, so October 2018, there are now 100 recovery residences in the state of Maine. So from 55 to 100 in 3 years. 21 of them accept MAT, so a huge increase in that. And 17 now in the last year have been certified by MAR, the Maine Association of Recovery Residences. So it's really been a lot of movement in the field, a lot of growth. Some people have gone out of business. You know, Serenity House has gone out of business, and a couple others. I won't mention them all. But new ones are popping up everywhere. You know, a year and a half ago, there were none in Sanford, for example. Now there's 3. They're opening up in Augusta and Auburn and out on the coast and in the smaller regions. We're just talking with Lacey about Aroostook County and Presque Isle. There's one that's open there. It's having some hard time, but Jesse's going to come to the rescue and open that house back up soon. So we know that there's a lot of movement in that field. There's a tremendous problem, though, with acceptance of medication-assisted treatment with the, I call them the predominant philosophy of recovery, which is complete abstinence. And this kind of came to a head about 5 years ago when the research began to really tilt towards accepting, if you accept evidence-based practice, you really have to look at medication-assisted treatment, not just in terms of harm reduction, but in terms of true recovery. Because these people from the outside, you couldn't tell that they were not an abstinence-based recovery, if you want to call it that. But they did extremely well. They got their lives back together. They didn't reoffend. They married. They got jobs. They saved money. They paid taxes. They looked just like anybody else. And as the medical evidence mounted and has continued to mount, it just became clear that we have to sort of look at this as a mainstream, not just a side stream, but a mainstream for people in recovery from opiate use disorder. The big change, the lightning bolt, was 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, when Hazelton Betty Ford said to their entire nationwide staff, we are going to embrace medication-assisted treatment. We're going to start what we call the Core 12 program. And they did that. And they've had amazing success. So they essentially offer all of their opiate use disorder patients who kind of fit that profile. It's very broad, not just in Minnesota, where Hazelden is based, or Betty Ford Center in California, but all of their satellites, and they have a lot of those around the country. So as the essential founder or mom and dad of treatment as we know it in the United States, Hazelton founded in 1949. So they've been doing this a long time. This was an earthquake. This was a paradigm shift that took a lot of people by surprise. Here in this area, and I talked to most of the people in the treatment community, not just in Portland, but all the other places in Maine, there still is a lot of resistance to accepting clients or patients as residents of their recovery houses who are on medication-assisted treatment. It's still there. One program manager said to me, well, Ron, it's sort of like they're going to have Suboxone as their higher power, right? It's not going to be some other spiritual concept. And so that's kind of some of the attitude that we find. On the other hand, there are some people that they don't want MAT, and they may have a different chemical drug of choice, and they're recovering from that, and they don't want to be around people who are on it for whatever reason. So it's hard to be a judge of that. I choose not to be, only to know that the medical evidence for treatment in this epidemic is really pointing towards the use of these medications with great success. Not only lowering rates of overdose for people who are in treatment or leaving jail, but a lot of other parameters as well. So I'll kind of leave it at that for now in terms of recovery residences and MAT, and I want to turn this over to Jesse, because Jesse's a person who has put this into effect with great success in terms of opening low barrier houses and bringing people in who have very little money in their pockets, growing your organization, which includes a board of directors and so forth and so on. So Jesse, how did you do it?
Thank you. about a year and a half into my recovery, I opened a recovery house in Biddeford. That one is no longer open, but for the first 6 months running that house, we did not accept people taking evidence-based medications as much as I wanted to, because by this point I was working in healthcare, my full-time job, and I fully understood and appreciated the evidence around, especially Suboxone and methadone. So then, why for the first 6 months did I not let people on medication in the house? Well, it's because I had a lot of residual feelings, usually misinformed thoughts and feelings from my experience in more traditional, abstinence-only recovery community circles. It was 6 months into running it that I said, you know what, we're going to give it a go, and we're going to try it. And immediately, several weeks and months later, I was amazed at how little trouble there was. Whereas I had been told that people were going to be dropping like flies, overdosing, selling their drugs. None of that was selling their medication. None of that was happening, and it was refreshing to finally be able to see people who are prescribed something, the gold standard by their medical provider. It was refreshing to finally be able to see these people also be accepted into a living environment in their community with their peers. I thought at the time, and I still think today, it's an absolute travesty that so many medical providers are giving people the gold standard for treatment of OUD, and then those same people will go out into the recovery community and get turned away, not only from meetings, but from homes too, often the only homes that they could possibly get into. If they have bad credit, a criminal record, no money, really a recovery house is probably the only choice for them. So 2 months later, we opened a second and a third location in Sanford, and it was sort of both in Sanford, and now we've opened one in Lewiston. We're about to open another in Auburn, and it was around the same time that I started to incorporate, allow people to take medication in the house, that I also started to realize being an evidence-based recovery house is about much more than just these medications. So I'd like to maybe sort of zoom out for a minute to explore that. What does evidence-based mean to me in regards to recovery housing? Not only that we allow people on medication, but also that we allow people working multiple pathways to recovery, because evidence shows that there are multiple pathways, right? It also means that we have naloxone in the house that we hope to never have to use, but if somebody does experience opiate poisoning, it doesn't have to be fatal. We have naloxone in the house. Unfortunately, some recovery houses historically have not allowed this life-saving medication in the house, and people have died in recovery houses because recurrence of symptoms it happens, right? Other ways in which we practice evidence-based recovery housing is that we connect people with resources in the community, cognitive behavioral therapy, an IOP, DBT, PCP, APC, not the kind you smoke, but the kind you see once a year, a PCP, primary care, and then also directly observed therapy, DOT, which I've really tried to look into how to make a recovery house as evidence-based as possible. And this isn't anything that I learned from other Mainers providing these services here. It's, DOT, directly observed therapy. I read a lot about how it was used for polio and for other conditions, that a family member or somebody else observing the person with medication taking it once a day, and that's an evidence-based practice, and that's what we do in our recovery houses. The house captain will observe the individual taking their medication once a day as prescribed, not diverting it, and compliance with somebody's treatment regimen is often one of the best predictors of the person's success in that treatment. So that's just zooming it out beyond just pharmacotherapy to all sorts of other evidence-based practices. If for a minute if we were to just disregard for a minute the validity of medication. Pretend it's not helpful, which obviously it is. But if it isn't, and if we want people to get off these, nobody should have to come off an evidence-based medication unless their doctor tells them to, and unless it's in their best interest. But if recovery houses that would rather see somebody be abstinent, entirely abstinent, not taking Suboxone or methadone, what's the best way for that to happen? Well, I say it's, offering somebody housing first and slowly working with the person, until they reach a point where they feel comfortable and empowered to stop taking medication on their own, instead of leaving people homeless on the streets, without supports that might encourage them to think about their relationship with medication. All this being said, I practice today abstinence-based recovery, and I don't take Suboxone or methadone, and I like my form of recovery, and if somebody who's using opiates does not want to be prescribed Suboxone or methadone, obviously it shouldn't be forced on them. So there's a place for abstinence-based and 12-step houses and faith-based. There's a place for all of those, right? But where the serious sort of and alarming mismatch is that the medical community and the public health infrastructure and law enforcement and the media are telling people, this is the gold standard. This is what works most often, and this is what works best. And then those same people are going to their peers and their only options for housing, and they're being told, no, you're dirty. Get out of here. That's a problem, So we do need abstinence-based houses and 12-step houses, but we need many, many, many more evidence-based and pharmacotherapy-friendly houses. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jesse and Ron. It's been a privilege to work with both Jesse and Ron over the years. I serve as general counsel to the Maine Association of Recovery Residences. In addition to serving as our liaison with the national organization and keeping us up to date about what's going on around the country, Ron has also served as an ombudsman, someone who helps resolve issues, disputes, and problems that arise in the recovery residence community in a way that involves a process that's fair, with allowing people to be heard and that sort of thing. This is all just my sort of parlay into the discussion about the current lack of regulation of recovery residences, which I'll take part of the blame for. But what that means is we've been regulating ourselves, and we formed MAR for the purpose of showing the community that if left alone and left to flourish and left to experiment, that we could not only thrive and help a lot of people, but we could begin to regulate ourselves. And MAR is doing a lot of great work in that area, and Ron is critical to that work. Jesse, the work he does speaks for itself. I would just say, Jesse's a leader in so many different areas. I think one thing that is consistent about Jesse is he goes out of his way to meet the need that's not being met. So MAT is just, one of the bigger ones, where people who are using medication-assisted treatment can't get recovery housing. It's not right. He knows it's not right. Jesse also knew there were a lot of people that weren't getting the recovery residence experience because of birth, what kind of family they were born into, pretty much. Not right. So what Jesse charges is well below his cost and certainly well below what others are charging. And so he's serving a population that otherwise wouldn't be able to have this wonderful experience, which is so critical after receiving some initial treatment. This has been, evidence has shown a highly effective way for people to remain healthy and well and get support. Women as well. Jesse opened one of the first, recovery houses for women in York County, probably the first in York County, the only one in York County. Very important. Women are an underserved population. If you look at all the recovery residences, I don't know if, Ron, you have the statistics as to how many of the 99 are men's houses versus women's, but women are an underserved population too. It's a privilege, as an attorney, my role is, to advise and to jump into the fray if there are any legal issues that come up. Most of the time, I'm just educating, I call it educating, cities and towns about what they can and can't do to my clients, basically. I prefer to have those friendly conversations. Sometimes it has to take the form of a letter. If the town is getting really close to doing something that's going to violate the law and get them sued, I'll try to make an appeal with a letter to save them a little trouble, and that usually works. But it really, these laws, they're not just, look, these laws exist for a reason. These folks should not be discriminated against, and people who are trying to help these folks shouldn't be targeted and run out of town. It's amazing how much more tolerance there is of a house rented by a bunch of college kids that like to drink beer and party and play loud music. Far more tolerance of those kinds of homes than homes that are serving people in recovery from some pretty tough stuff. So, but that's just, society's going to take time. We have to treat society with love around all this stuff. I think we have to treat folks that are not quite yet there, like fellow travelers on the road, and maybe it means we need to sit down and spend more of our time and have conversations, long conversations, give our time, and also hear what they have to say and why they're not quite there supporting, whether it's safe injection sites or that kind of thing. The last thing I'd say about, why it is, I think it's important from the standpoint as a humanitarian to be doing everything we possibly can from a harm reduction standpoint that will save lives or alleviate suffering. Okay? I think the main, in my view, the main reason we have to do that at every single turn, at every opportunity, is because these people need to know that they're loved.
That's my attorney.
There's been a lot of concern about how do you manage these bottles of pills and Suboxone strips and all of that in a house with 16 addicts. Do you just sort of like leave them on the counter, put them in the refrigerator, or what? So Jesse and others, myself and some other places around the country, have developed methodologies to kind of keep everything safe. The National Alliance of Recovery Residences has come out with a kind of a how-to, like a standard for houses that are certified under their banner. To become a certified house, certified by MAR and endorsed by NAR, the national organization, you have to meet 11 pages of certification standards. I do have a copy of them here, but no sense in going over them now. There's just a lot of them. And they have things as simple as you got to have a good neighbor policy. You have to do community service. You have to reach out to your neighborhood. You have to be a good neighbor. You actually have to do things like that. Because we have found over the years, of course, that pays a lot of dividends. Anybody here ever suffered from NIMBYism? NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? We don't want all those places, in my neighborhood. Not knowing that these young men and women will help you with will help you with hauling leaves, with sweeping out your basement, doing snow removal for you, and most of the houses when they open will go around saying, hey, this is what we can do in your neighborhood. We're going to have an open house. Please come and visit us. The invitation was made to Governor LePage to come to a house that was opened in Lewiston. Was that Lewiston? And he came. Of course, he first had to have a bashing by one of the senatorial candidates, Mr. Ringelstein, who said something to him like, "Our governor should be in jail." This was before we actually began the program, so our governor was not too happy with that. But he did get up and gave a talk, and the fact that he would come to a recovery house opening and lend the gravitas of the governor's office to that. Times have changed, and that's really a plus. In reality, most houses will operate what they call a double lockbox system for security. So there's a large safe. It could be a file cabinet, usually a safe that you normally expect in a business, and it may be biometric. So like the house manager's finger will open it up, or a combination. And then inside this secure safe, there'll be a number of lock boxes with numbers or names. So each resident has their own lockbox. So they could put in any controlled substances, anything they don't want out in the general population. Maybe there's a credit card or some money they want to keep safe. And the staff of the recovery residence does not have access to that lockbox. Only the client. So by doing that kind of system, the resident managers, they control access to the box, but they can't get in the box without a key from the resident, him or herself. That system has worked pretty well. Jesse's worked well in your places, and it's become a national standard, really, for that kind of system or variation of it to be instituted in virtually all these places. I mean, it seems pretty simple, but a lot of people just say, well, I don't want to go to all that trouble. You really have to, and that's also if you have a mixed house, where you have MAT for some residents and not MAT for the others. That you really need to. First of all, be sure that when people move in, not on MAT, that they know that that's the environment, but to kind of keep the aisles clear. Once you admit people who are on MAT, on Suboxone or methadone, the question always seems to come up very quickly, what about other stuff? Because recovery residences that are abstinence-based and don't allow these things, they won't really let you, while you're there, take like Vyvanse, which is an amphetamine derivative for ADD. They won't let you take gabapentin, which is like a pain medicine, anti-seizure medicine, but also used for pain. You can't be on a benzo of any type, even if it's been long-standing. So there's a long do not take list or cannot take while you're here list, and that's not perhaps the way things are going to be for these folks when they get out of the recovery house environment. They're going to be back in the real world where they have control over what they take. And so you're saying you got to live life like you're going to in the recovery residence, but you can't take these meds that your doctor prescribed. But then when you leave, you can take them again. That's kind of a difficult message and a difficult adjustment for clients to make. Can I jump in here? So Jess is going to jump in.
And so I would maintain that that's illegal to deprive somebody of their medication that is prescribed by a doctor. And I would actually say, I've seen some people who deprived of, who they should be on Suboxone or methadone, one of those, they're not allowed to. But guess what else they're not allowed to take is an antipsychotic that they might be prescribed. And sometimes I'd say that's even more detrimental, and then 6 months later, they're in a horrible place mentally, and they get released, and they're out in the world, like Dr. Springle was just saying, and they're vastly underprepared for it, not ready for it, and that 6-month experience that they had at a recovery house that deprived them of their evidence-based medication was actually 6 months of detrimental to their recovery. And when I say recovery here, I mean not only recovery from substance use disorder, but mental health and holistic wellness as well. So I just wanted to jump in to say that. I wanted to, two other things that I forgot to mention earlier in regards to this evidence-based that I'm hoping to practice within the field of recovery-oriented housing is that we also use destigmatized language when referring to our residents, that they're people first, people in recovery, people with substance use disorder, people who use drugs, etc., and other destigmatized language, including misuse instead of abuse. You know, a lot of this taken straight out of the new DSM-5, which has abandoned those old hurtful words that are hurtful, not only emotionally hurtful, but actually shown to reduce the quality of care that people receive and negatively impact their life expectancy and their prospects for recovery. One thing that I want to address that is probably on a lot of people's minds, and it was on mine, right, for that first 6 months that I wasn't allowing people in on medication was, what about the people who don't want what everybody else in the house wants? I'm not going to say they don't want recovery. Maybe they do want recovery. They don't want to be living under a bridge, injecting fentanyl every day. But what if they still want to take their Suboxone how they want to take it? And what if they still want to sell some of it? And what if they, So just to make clear, I believe those people deserve housing as well, but it's not going to be in one of my recovery houses because it would be injurious to the recovery of the others who are in the house. So one of the ways that we sort of determine who's the best candidate for the house is through the interview process. We do a drug test, and anything that is not, so I say you have to pass the interview and you have to pass the drug test. From the drug test, everything has to be a negative screen except for anything that the person is maybe prescribed. And cannabis, it's okay to test positive upon moving in for cannabis, and then after 30 days it should be out. So the drug test and the interview. And the interview is many, many, many questions, but it essentially boils down to what kind of housing and what kind of recovery is that person looking for? And is it the kind that will mesh well with everybody else's in the house as well?
So how do you folks feel about CBD, like cannabidiol, like THC oil? You feel good about it. How would you feel if you were in a recovery residence and your roommate was taking CBD oil and you were not? What do we need to do in those cases? We need education, right? We need some education. There was, for years and years, our government did not allow research about THC, and we're finding out now is it has some benefits. Now, for a person in recovery from the abuse or use of mind-altering substances, which marijuana can be, especially with high THC contents, one must be very careful when we touch on this subject, especially with the changing political climate and with THC, with marijuana being, cannabis being legal in, 11 states now? And certainly here in our state. But it's not the absolute prohibition in terms of treatment and recovery communities that it used to be. So we're trying to develop basically standards or policy statements, around that. There is only anecdotal use. Whatever you've heard, there is not true scientific evidence-based studies that show that THC with the active ingredient really benefit people who are in recovery or need treatment for opiate use disorder. There's no current body of scientific evidence that's been kind of accepted that demonstrates that. There's a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotal use. A lot of people will say, hey, it really helped me, but that's really not enough for us to say, hey, all you should be providing cannabis to your opiate use disorder clients, whether they want it or not. This is something completely different. Okay, so we need to be cautious there.
And I would also add as well that Maine's medical marijuana law, as it currently stands, still only allows treatment for physical disorders. So, for example, it is not detoxing or dealing with opiate withdrawal is not a sanctioned use of medical marijuana right now. So that's another reason why for a variety of reasons, it's in a different classification in regard to, like what Jesse can do in his houses and others. I did want to make sure there was time for questions from the audience, so maybe we could reserve the balance of the time for that.
Hi, I have a quick question. So I'm a nurse at one of the medical organizations, and we're very frequently now seeing patients who are inpatient for their 6 weeks of antibiotics, and they're being inducted on MAT. And it feels that we're doing them a disservice because we're not engaging them as actively as we could be in the recovery community. And so I didn't know if there was also any additional thought to the future of these are patients who, if they didn't have a substance use disorder, we would be sending them home with home health to be completing their antibiotics. Whether or not in recovery housing there is a future potentially where we could, where that could potentially be happening. And thank you for all the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you. Was there a question in there you really wanted to address?
Yeah, is that something that's sort of in the thought process as we look towards the future of this epidemic, and how can we be providing holistic care to the people who we're taking care of?
Excellent question. Thank you. How can we provide holistic care within the continuum of medical care from a patient such as yours who's receiving treatment for like infection, they want to go home on antibiotics, but that there's a SUD, substance use disorder, to be of concern, and how would that affect your discharge planning? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, we typically don't let them leave until their antibiotics are done. And then we let them finish their antibiotics in the hospital, and then hopefully are able to get them into recovery housing, where there could be an earlier transition to recovery housing while they're still on the antibiotics.
Is that because of concern that they're
They would be using their
right? Right. Yeah. PIC lines. Yeah.
Yeah, that's convenient, isn't it? If you're an IV drug user and you have a PIC line, one of those big IVs that kind of sticks up here. Well, I think that's certainly a concern, in that population. But on the other hand, if they're under any type of supervision, it doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive type that you provide. That would seem to be a reasonable approach. Okay.
I think there is definitely an opportunity to release people sooner, and in doing so, have the city, the state, public health infrastructure, and hospitals save a lot of money doing so. Putting somebody in a place that costs $500 to $1,000 a month instead of a hospital that might cost that every day, right, or even more. And I think sort of like respite almost. I think there is an opportunity there, and I think it sort of touches on something we haven't mentioned yet, which is the levels of housing, right? There's 4 levels of housing from 1, which I'll actually let Ron talk about the levels.
Briefly, the National Alliance certifies through their affiliates, which is the main chapter, 4 different levels of recovery houses. You won't see this in the house that's not certified by MAR, but if you look on the website, as of the board meeting yesterday, they're now going to include, if you're a certified house, what level you're at. So level 1 is like an Oxford house, where you have folks there, men or women, either one, who are in a house that doesn't have a lot of supervision, doesn't have a live-in house manager, doesn't have a real program, but it is a safe and sober environment where folks typically stay longer, they get a job, they work. It's kind of like a larger, group home as opposed to a residence that has a lot of active programming. And then you go up from there to level 2 all the way up to level 4. You still don't need any type of certificates from the state or any advanced certification. It just has to do with how much that you provide. Level 2 would usually have a built-in house manager, maybe some transportation to take folks around, for meetings, maybe some help with job search and a few things like that. You go up to level 3 house, and all of a sudden now you may be having, group meetings and maybe some therapy actually in the house. It's a higher level, usually a higher cost, and then level 4 is really when you're doing treatment per se out of the house, but are still technically a recovery residence. So those are the 4 levels. The other thing that MAR requirements, NAR requirements have is what if you have to develop your own criteria for discharging a person before they want to go. But what criteria are they going to be? And what are you going to do with the person who you decide to discharge? Are you going to just kick them to the street, give them the address for Oxford Street Shelter or wherever you happen to be, say good luck? So that is anathema to our organization, to the national organization. You just cannot do that. If they don't have a place to go, you kind of have to hold on to them until they have a place. That doesn't mean you're responsible for paying for a motel for them or anything else. But every house that I work with, that we work with, has a plan and has a list of places you can refer to. If a person has sort of made the environment around them toxic in one particular residence, we understand they may need to make a change. But it doesn't mean they're homeless on the street for 3 or 4 days until they can arrange for admission to another facility. So the facilities work together, hand in hand, to make sure this happens, and this has to be a matter of policy. All right, any other questions? We have about 15 minutes or so.
I have a question, I think, for Jesse. If the person, everything I know about people with substance use disorder, I've learned from the people who have substance use disorder as a substance abuse clinician. And I see when you say MAT, and that includes both Suboxone and methadone, I see a huge difference between those two drugs from what I've heard. And what I've heard is that, and I could be wrong, so that's why I'm asking the question. With the methadone, the person has to go to physically pick it up each morning. And many of the people complain that by nighttime, they have to buy heroin because it didn't last long enough for them. And the people who are on Suboxone, some do well and some sell it in order to get a drug that will make them even higher because the Suboxone isn't meeting their needs. So if a person's on methadone and lives in your house, does he or she have to go every day to get it, or do you control it there somehow?
So we've actually only had one person on methadone, and they have gone to the clinic in the mornings to get it. That person never had take-home doses, but if they did, and they did bring it home, it would be locked in the safe, and the administration would be done under the observation of the house captain.
So the question had to do with methadone versus Suboxone and the relative advantages and disadvantages of each. Of course, that's usually up to the prescribing physician and the patient to sort of figure out what might be best. Generally speaking, methadone, which is a Schedule II drug as opposed to less restriction on Suboxone, is generally not given as take-home, except maybe you'll get 1 or 2 take-home doses in the morning. So you have to go every morning, go to the clinic, line up, get your dose. Methadone typically has a duration of action of 24 to 32 hours, but it doesn't for everyone, especially if they're on some kind of decreasing dosage schedule. So they may get some symptoms at the end of the day or certainly in the morning before they get their next dose. So that can be a problem that needs to be addressed with the prescribing physician. Buprenorphine can be used in situations where they don't need as heavy a maintenance, because there reaches a point where buprenorphine is no longer effective no matter what dose you give, and you have to go to methadone in that case. That methadone is like the backup for those folks. But whenever possible, prescribers try to use buprenorphine first, Suboxone first, and then if that's not effective, they may need to move to methadone. Reason, of course, is that you can give a prescription for a month or so of Suboxone, and you just get into the safe, once a day or twice a day and take your dose. Usually it's a twice a day dosage, like 8 milligrams in the morning, 8 at night, something like that seems to work for a lot of people. So there's a lot of differences in the efficacy, duration of action, the length of action, and as far as the outcomes are concerned, those doses have to be matched pretty well to the clinical situation, or else it doesn't work that well. I hope that's helpful.
Hi, I've got a question over here. My name is Selma. I'm a physician who worked at Maine Integrative Healthcare with Dr. Daniel Sad and Dustin Sulak, and now I'm teaching around here locally. And I just wanted to say thank you for the work that you're doing and starting this and trying to raise the awareness in the original perspective of abstinence-only treatment. But I do want to raise the question about the cannabis perspective, because while you do say there is no quality evidence, we have to agree that if we're going to go on the traditional hierarchy of evidence, that of course there's going to be no double-blinded randomized controlled trials looking at cannabis and the use of substance use, and people are working on that. But there are a good handful of well-crafted epidemiological studies, Amanda Ryman's work, Zach Walsh's work, that are showing that people who are using cannabis to transition off of opioids specifically has been really effective. And so I think if we're going to be stuck in that original definition of what quality evidence is, we're not going to really progress that discussion. And so one question is, what do you think would have to happen to change that perspective? Because the situation I'm seeing when I certify patients for post-traumatic stress, and I'm a physician who technically, I'm not doing a prescription, but I'm doing a recommendation, and I feel that is going to be beneficial to their therapy, especially the connection with trauma and substance misuse disorders. I would just like to know, one, from your perspective, if we're just going to have an agreement on this progression, what has to change?
Well, I think a lot of that is also perception. So Selma's talking about cannabis and what would it take for kind of mainstream folks to accept that in the course of opioid use disorder treatment, especially transitioning from using to not using. I have an extremely open mind about cannabis. I think it's kind of gotten a bad rap from the days of Reefer Madness, if you remember that fabulous film, Oscar-winning film, suitable for Halloween because it's just like that. I guess what I would have to see to be even more accepting of cannabis in our field is a longer period of time and more experience right in our own backyard with how that's working for people. Because I read probably a lot of the same journals that Selma does. Maybe she reads more than I do. But no matter what I read in the journals, I like to see it with my own two eyes in practice. I like to, and I'm retired now, so my practice is going to the recovery houses, talking to people at meetings, hearing their stories, what has worked for you, just a different viewpoint. But I think that in terms of what I would recommend in comfort and what the policies of the recovery residences would be, what we advocate for at a state, national level, all have to do with, well, what has your experience been and what is your comfort level with that? Mine's a lot different than it was just a couple of years ago. I think that's evolving and changing. And I think, more studies like the one Selma was referencing that are epidemiologic in nature or similar to the extent that we can do those with people, legally and ethically, would be a benefit. So I think it's a stay tuned kind of thing, keep an open mind, and we'll see how we do day to day.
I want to give a shout out to Greener Pastures Holistic Care for the groundbreaking cannabis and kratom-assisted therapy scientific studies that they're going to be doing in collaboration with an educational institution, really helping to pave the way for other pathways to recovery to be recognized, as you've said. And, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, cannabis, kratom, also such medications as ibogaine, which unfortunately the science is being suppressed around, but there's a lot of stuff that suggests that is the most effective addiction interrupter ever, period. And it's unfortunately a Schedule I drug in this country. There's one other thing that I wanted to say, just looking at the recovery-oriented housing industry, I've only been in it for 2 years myself, but from the research I've done and from what people have told me, it's been mostly peer run. I'm a peer. I'm not a clinician. 2 years ago, I was not with a major nonprofit. So this has always been a need. Of course, now it's more a need now that more people, especially wealthy and white and affluent people, are passing away. But 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was just as much of a need, and people are dying on the streets for alcohol, their alcohol use. And at the time, there's studies that show the efficacy of the Oxford House model and even 12-step house models, but they weren't around in sufficient numbers, and even still right now they aren't around in sufficient numbers. And even though this is such a useful public health intervention, recovery-oriented housing that is backed by its own studies, the traditional nonprofit industry has failed to provide this much needed service, and it's been peers at the front lines opening houses and providing this service. And now, several decades too late, we're finally starting to see involvement by nonprofits. Don't get me wrong, that's great, and I'd love to see more and more nonprofits open houses, especially houses that are in line with the evidence, low cost, low barrier. So I'd like to mention, again, I'd like to bring up safe injection sites. There aren't any grants available right now to do that, but get out there and do it anyway.
was on the question up front.
Just like to ask about, the epidemic has likely reached every town in every county, and how does one go about bringing a recovery house to our county, Franklin County, Somerset County, Scotticus County? There's only so many Jessies, but there's 16 counties.
Thank you for the question. So it had to do with how do we essentially expand the recovery house model, and how do we get them to open in some of the more rural counties where they haven't reached yet. And if you look through the directory, you see all the places that we're at. There's a lot of places that we're not, that these services are not available. So the recent appropriation that Dr. Letourneau and some others worked with in the state legislature this year, I think we got $8.5 million or something like that, $6.5 million, quite a bit. There was actually some support in there. So you have the hub and the center and the spokes go out to all these rural counties, that in those spoke areas that there is some money for recovery housing in those budgets. Now, all those details haven't been worked out yet, but that was a direct input from our organization and from others that to solve that problem, because otherwise you're just talking about entrepreneurs who are dedicated, because you have to be like Jesse, not just interested in making money, but doing a good service, because these are hard places to get and operate. You have NIMBYism with some of the folks in your town, even though we all think it's good, but don't do it next to me. There's a lot of issues to overcome. Why would I want those headaches? And especially if I don't live in that community. And if you live in that community, where do I get the help? Now, the state organization, MAR, will assist individuals who want to open houses in their communities. We recently helped one open on the coast in Rockland, which has been very successful. Dr. Ira Mandel retired, and he's now operating that. Some of you may know him. So those are the kind of things that we can help with. MAR can help, the legislature's helping with some funds. And once people see that there's some money available to provide vouchers for people to live there, then that'll open up a lot of the more rural communities. But until that happens, it has to be individuals in the community who reach out and say, what do I need to do to get started? We will help do that.
If I could add to that, that's well said, Doctor. I think this is peer-to-peer up and down the chain, okay? So not just, the people in Journey House helping each other through a difficult experience, but peer-to-peer among people who, operate recovery residences and people who want to go into that field. It's one of although most of it is for-profit, in terms of the percentages by far, it's one of the least competitive for-profit fields I know. People, give away their sober living agreements to someone who's going to open a sober house up, across town. And certainly, I think what we haven't seen enough of is that level of support for rural communities. So I think the Portland Recovery House community needs to step up and begin to, they already have in forming MAR. This was critical. This was a big part of forming MAR. We wanted this experience to grow far beyond Portland. That's why it was called MAR, not PAR. And I think educating as well landlords. I'd say half of my clients don't own their own real estate. So, I'm commonly working with someone who owns real estate, has nothing to do with the recovery field. I convince him that rather than running around collecting 4 different rent checks, he can collect one, and it'll be above market. And there'll be no drinking or drug use in his house, and we'll do a 3-year lease. Most of your residential leases are 1. So, pretty soon, once word spreads among the real estate community that this is not only can you help people and feel good about yourself, but you can make a lot more money than you can just leasing single-family homes and apartments and stuff. So,
Do we have time for one more, or are we out of time?
Of the
So the question was of the 21, thank you for that. It's really, really great. Of the 21 houses in the state, how many accept women? And maybe how many accept women on MAT versus not? So there's a new house in Sanford that just opened called the Bridge House. They accept men and women and MAT. The Amistad House in Westbrook accepts women and MAT also. The Back Bay Oxford House for women does not accept MAT, but they accept women. The Beacon House, same story. Women in Portland, no MAT. Crossroads in Wyndham, women and children, yes, they accept MAT, but it's really on a taper basis, sort of. If you're on it when you come in, you can keep taking it, but it's usually for the pregnant population. Yes.
Can I?
There's
if I
Jesse has one in Sanford. Okay.
Opened a second one in Auburn as well.
Is that open yet?
In 2 weeks.
Okay. James Place in Augusta does accept women on MAT. Okay.
I'll add one more. To be opened. Many of you might have heard that Milestone Recovery, formerly known as Milestone Foundation, they received a very generous grant from NextGen, and they have recently purchased real estate and will be opening a women's recovery residence in Portland that will accept women who take medication-assisted treatment. So that should be opening, I think, by the end of the year. So that's going to be, and of course, that's also a place that's going to work with women who may not be able to afford to pay on their own.
Which one? Is it one of Wellsprings? So Wellspring Infinity House in Bangor, women MAT, yes, and the women's residence, which is different, also in Bangor, also accepts MAT for women. No, I didn't. No, right. Whole House is separate. They're not listed in the directory for either they were admitted in error or there's something about them that's just different than the other listings. I'd have to find out.
Please, if you have questions, please feel to grab any of us afterward. It's been a pleasure presenting today.
Also, I'll
We're
leave this
out of
up here
time.
for anyone that wants to sign up to receive the emails of the directory and its updates. Please feel free to come up and do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.